CIA officer Aldrich Ames was ordinary, kinda lazy, and not very into his job, but those middle-of-the-road attributes are actually what made him an incredibly effective agent for the KGB. Aldrich Ames didn't grow up dreaming of being a spy, but his father worked for the CIA, and Ames landed a temporary clerical job at the agency starting in 1957 while he was still in high school. Still, he resisted. He went to attend the University of Chicago in 1959, planning to major in history or some other cultural field. But he was so much in love with the theater that his grades suffered and he dropped out. Sounds like a recipe for a super spy. Exposure to the agency, a background in history and culture, and a passion for play acting? Origin story unlocked. All Ames needed was time to realize his destiny. After he quit college, he went on to work as an assistant technical director in a Chicago theater, a job that requires plenty of MacGyvering to make things work with what you've got on hand and in budget, all to convince an audience to believe what you're showing them. Ames then returned to the CIA as a full-time clerk. While there, he earned a history degree from George Washington University in 1967. He was no angel, something else that goes into being a good spy and is essential in a double agent. Ames had occasional brushes with the law, including reckless driving, speeding, and alcohol use, but he received decent enough evaluations and consistent promotions. And by the late 60s, Ames was on the path to becoming a career operations agent. By the end of the decade, Ames and his first wife, Nancy Siegerbarth, another CIA trainee who was pushed to resign after their marriage, were assigned to a post in Ankara, Turkey. At first, Ames' work in Ankara was well received and he got another promotion, but then his performance dipped. 3 years into the assignment, higher-ups were beginning to think Ames wasn't suited for field work and should be sent back to headquarters to sit behind a desk. Even Ames later admitted he thought about resigning around this time. He was sent back to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, where he was assigned to the Soviet East European Division, but his work still wasn't stellar. His issues with alcohol and persistent procrastination were painfully apparent. By the late 70s, though, Ames, now assigned to an office in New York City, started out with glowing reviews of his well-written reports and proficiency with languages. But not everything was copacetic. In 1976, while on his way to meet with a Soviet contact, Ames forgot a briefcase of classified documents on the New York City subway.
Anything hot?
Oh, well, top acid dossier, photos, codes, emergency phone numbers, and a list of safe houses.
Yeah, not great. In 1980, he left top-secret communications equipment sitting out in plain view in his office. Looking back, these sound like huge red flags, but Ames was never officially reprimanded. Talk about oops. Ames' career as a desk jockey was short-lived. Eventually, he was working directly with Soviet contacts, first on American soil and then overseas. Again, he got middling reviews. The bosses said he didn't have the charisma necessary to be a field agent, and Ames' procrastination was still a problem. Then there was the drinking. At an embassy reception in Mexico City, Ames got into a shouting match with a Cuban representative, after which Ames was sent to counseling. He went once. Even with all of his issues, by September 1983, Ames was promoted to counterintelligence branch chief for Soviet operations, and he had thoughts. According to the National Security Archive, Ames later claimed, "Our Soviet espionage efforts had virtually never produced any worthwhile political or economic intelligence on the Soviet Union." Is he right? Who knows? It's above our security clearance. Maybe Ames's motivation was ideological, but it was probably way more basic. The way he put it, it was a matter of trying to make some money. Ames was involved with Rosario Casas de Puy, a Colombian embassy employee he'd met in Mexico City. By 1983, they were living together in the US, and Ames was embroiled in an expensive divorce. For her part, Rosario had expensive taste.
He was never going to be able to keep Rosario in the fashion she wanted to be kept.
Ames was desperate, so in the spring of 1985, he decided to solve his money problems by selling intel to the Soviets. You might know it by its other name, treason.
My name is Aldrich Ames. I work for the CIA.
That really happened. Seriously. Ames strolled right into the city's Soviet embassy and handed the receptionist an envelope. Inside was confirmation of his CIA affiliation, the identities of some double agents, and a request for $50,000. The KGB was delighted. According to Ames, this was meant to be a one-off, but as he testified to the Senate, it came home to me, the enormity of what I had done, the fear that I had crossed the line, which I had not clearly considered before. He could have turned back at that moment, but instead he admitted, it led me then to make the further step, which in a sense was to cast myself into it. Ames wasn't doing subtle spycraft. He'd often just grab classified documents, wrap them in plastic, and hand them over to the KGB in person. Part of his day job was to meet with Soviet diplomats, so having lunch with one of them seemed normal. It was a great cover for burning double agents and informants, or passing top-secret tech developments to the enemy. Sometimes Ames used what's known as a dead drop, leaving information at a predetermined site, like a particular garbage can or under an innocuous park bench, where contact would then grab it. Ames would alert his contact by leaving a chalk mark on an unassuming corner mailbox. If his KGB contact picked up the package, they'd erase the chalk mark so Ames would know the deed had been done. Ames may have been a mediocre CIA operative, but for the KGB, he was a gold mine. Between the fall of 1985 and into 1986, about 20 CIA agents in the Soviet Union vanished. An operational flub might get 1 or 2 agents arrested, but 20? The agency knew they had a double agent among their ranks. Even the public knew. By 1986, the Washington Post suggested that, after all the arrests, the KGB might run out of spies to apprehend. So why didn't the CIA get to work and root out the mole? At the time, there was a real culture of paranoia and disillusionment at the agency. Anyone could be a spy, so the communication and collaboration needed to catch Ames was fraught with anxiety. Hey, maybe there was no double agent. Maybe they'd been hacked, or there was a genius and super lucky KGB agent who had their number. And then there was a matter of pride. Admitting there was a mole and asking the rival FBI for help with a domestic investigation to ferret them out would mean serious embarrassment. It's hard to overstate the damage caused by Ames' betrayal.
He basically wiped out all the U.S. government's human source collection.
It effectively ended all CIA work in the Soviet Union and led to the executions of high-level assets like General Dmitry Polyakov.
He was the most important spy we had ever had.
That's not hyperbole. You can make a solid case that the U.S. opening relations with mainland China was directly related to info Polyakov provided. Some, like KGB official and double agent Oleg Gordievsky, barely escaped. Gordievsky's defection wasn't the most thriller-worthy, but he did have to hide in a car trunk along the way. As for Ames, he didn't seem to be super concerned about the blood on his hands. He might have been a so-so agent, but when it came to justifying his actions, he was a pro, explaining, "I had come to the conclusion that the loss of these sources to the United States government, or to the West as well, would not compromise significant national defense, political, diplomatic interests. Never mind that those losses were human lives." Ames didn't let himself go there, saying, "I'm sure I must have thought in terms of these guys will actually be okay in certain ways because of their need to protect me, but that was about as far as I went in terms of giving that consideration."
To Rick Ames, this is just the business.
That's some seriously compartmentalized mob-like thinking. Speaking of mobster stuff, you know that rule gangsters aren't supposed to break?
Listen, have to go buy anything for a while?
Well, they did. They bought multiple Jaguars and a house in Arlington, Virginia worth $540,000, which they paid in cash. Ames also paid for Rosario's education at the very pricey Georgetown University and sent money to her family in Columbia. Ames occasionally tried to explain away the disparity between his modest CIA salary and all that spending.
He said that she, Rosario, had money.
He told others that the house was purchased by an uncle who was unusually pleased about the birth of Ames' son. Meanwhile, Ames took care to move the money around between multiple accounts with a touch of Swiss banking to keep things quiet. Then Diana Worthen, a fellow CIA employee who'd worked for Ames, became friends with Rosario. In the late 80s, they were talking about Rosario's big plans for remodeling their new home, when Rosario dropped the fact that they'd bought the place for cash. Just so we're clear, this is 1993, and a guy making like $60K dropped almost 10 times that on a new house. This stunned Worthen, and rightfully so, because she knew how much Ames was making, and she brought her concern back to the agency. When the CIA opened a financial inquiry, they saw alarmingly large deposits into Ames' bank account throughout the 1980s. When investigator Sandy Grimes dug a little deeper, she realized that shortly after Ames had a meeting with a Soviet official, a big cash deposit would materialize in his bank account. The joint CIA-FBI team now had a focus for their investigation.
We had rented a house right across the street from him that we had put a video camera on.
Agents followed Ames, bugged his phone lines, and installed listening devices in his workplace, home, and car. The agency even used a small Cessna airplane dubbed the Flying Screw to surveil his movements to the point where Ames' neighbors complained about the low-flying plane. This kind of operation has a lot of moving parts.
Our guys had already determined weeks in advance what type of lock Rick had on his door and how to defeat it.
A team went into Ames' home, broke out the drills, planted bugs, and sealed up the holes with drywall patches.
We videoed everything Rick did through a pinhole camera in his ceiling in his office.
While the bugging provided key evidence, the real break came when agents went dumpster diving.
I had a
What do you guys-
wonderful time going through his trash, and that really was one of the keys to this investigation.
They found a small post-it note detailing an upcoming meeting with a KGB contact in Bogota, Colombia. The FBI tailed Ames to South America and recorded the meeting, but they didn't get clear evidence of an exchange. Still, they were getting close. Finally, after nearly a decade of espionage, Ames was arrested in early 1994. The CIA and FBI had evidence of Ames's guilt, but they wanted to catch him in the act of either passing information or receiving a payment. When that didn't pan out, time became a factor. Ames was arrested one day before he was scheduled to fly to Moscow. It was an official CIA trip. Ames had by then, wisely, been transferred out of counterintelligence to counter-narcotics. Still, agents worried that once Ames reached Russia, they'd never get him back.
We could not take the risk of him leaving the country.
Ames was arrested at his Arlington home and charged with conspiracy to commit espionage and tax evasion. Rosario was also arrested under the same charges. They both surrendered their assets to the U.S. and pleaded guilty.
I share the shock and the outrage. You don't betray your mother, you don't betray your country, you don't betray your wife.
She had to know something was up. Just look at her spending habits. Turns out she was the Imelda Marcos of undergarments.
When the FBI raided their home, they found 150 boxes of pantyhose that had never even been opened.
Rosario was given a 63-month sentence and has since been released, but Ames received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He's currently serving time in a federal penitentiary. Did he express remorse? Well, yes and no. When angling for a lighter sentence, he mentioned his shame for his actions, but he was also pretty defiant, going as far as to say he didn't think his actions damaged the US government. So in the end, he really was like a mobster.
It was only business.
The Ames case is known as the worst espionage case in US history, but he was hardly alone in his work. There was also Edward Lee Howard, a CIA officer who eventually defected to the Soviet Union and died there under mysterious circumstances in 2002. Then there was Robert Hansen, an FBI agent who fed information to the Soviet Union and then Russia from 1979 until 2001, handing over so much classified info that the damage caused by his espionage rivals that of Ames. In fact, Hansen probably deserves his own video. We'll see what we can do there. But in short, Hansen was sentenced to 15 life terms and remained in federal prison until his death in 2023. In fact, Ames's arrest led the FBI to realize that they too had a mole, leading to the investigation that caught Hansen. Now, here's the scary part. There's a theory that these three men didn't have access to all the information that Russian agents received, meaning that there very well could be a fourth spy still out there somewhere. And there is some evidence to back this up, as well as a few likely suspects, including alarmingly high-level officials who were investigated but never definitively identified.